How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Climate change was more visible in the presidential election than ever before. Now, as President Biden folds climate policies into every federal agency, there are more pathways and political will for the clean energy transition. How quickly can the new administration turn around a gutted EPA, myriad environmental rollbacks, and a legacy of climate denial? What are the key tools and actions the Biden administration can take to address the urgency of the climate crisis? Join us for a conversation on climate breaking through in 2021 with Michael Mann, director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University and author of The New Climate War: The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, and Leah Stokes, assistant professor of political science at UC Santa Barbara and author of Short-Circuiting Policy: Interest Groups in the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. A clean start on climate, today on Climate One. Leah Stokes, Joe Biden referred to the Green New Deal as a framework for his ambitious climate plan that pledged $2 trillion for clean energy over 4 years. You're an enthusiastic supporter of the Green New Deal. What are the prospects for that vision to become reality in a narrowly divided Congress and a pandemic that's ravaging the economy?
What I'm really an enthusiastic supporter of is climate action. I really want to see federal climate policy like so many of us do. And I think with the elections in Georgia in early January, changing Senate control to the Democrats, we have the best opportunity in more than a decade now to see federal climate action through legislation. Of course, we also have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the White House, and they have made really bold pledges. They've committed to, as you mentioned, $2 trillion spending over 4 years, a 100% clean energy target by 2035, and 40% of investments to go to disadvantaged and frontline communities. These are the boldest climate pledges we have ever seen for any presidential candidate and now president in American history. So I am very enthusiastic that we have a really good shot to start to do federal climate action this year.
President Biden has a $1.9 trillion relief package, largely for COVID, for aid to state and local governments. The details are not out yet, but that doesn't really include a lot of climate. So 2 trillion, another 2 trillion, that's a lot of trillions, Leah Stokes.
Well, I think we need to remember, and this is actually something we did an entire episode on in our podcast, A Matter of Degrees, how much money the Republicans spent during the pandemic. A lot of it actually went to fossil fuel companies through the CARES Act, which was a large bailout to big fossil fuel companies. And so we always seem to have money, $20 billion a year, for example, in direct fossil fuel subsidies by our federal government every single year. There's always money for the fossil fuel economy. And so what we really need to be doing is starting to spend money on rebuilding our economy for the clean energy future. And that really is the cornerstone of Biden's plan, the Build Back Better agenda. And, on the one hand, you might say, wow, this is a lot of spending, but these are actually investments. They pay themselves back, right? If we clean up our air, it means that we have less asthma for young Black children, for example. It means that we have less early mortality for people. And that actually has benefits for our economy. If we start investing in new jobs in the clean energy economy, those jobs will create multipliers and they will pay us back. So this isn't just money like a fossil fuel bailout that gets sort of blown up in smoke after we spend it. It's money that multiplies over time. It really is like an investment.
Michael Mann, do you think the Green New Deal should be the North Star of U.S. efforts to confront climate disruption?
Well, I think the goals of the Green New Deal, as described by AOC, Ed Markey, are laudable. And ultimately, I think we need an expansive approach to climate action that does deal with all of the intersectional issues that come with climate change. The pragmatist in me, like Leah, I want to see action immediately. We don't have any time to waste. We've got 10 years basically to bring global carbon emissions down by a factor of 2. And so in the current environment with a split 50-50 Senate, I wish we had had a blue wave, a congressional blue wave that swept in large majorities, large Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, and had the votes to pass expansive Green New Deal type legislation. But that's not what materialized. We have a closely divided Senate. We also have a president, as Leah has mentioned, who is very committed to climate action, who is using basically every tool at his disposal, incorporating climate action into every agency, into every appointment. And so we can make a lot of progress on the executive side, repairing our relationships with other countries, once again, reasserting ourselves on the international stage as a leader in climate action. But it would be great if we could also at least get some climate legislation in the meantime. And, I agree with Leah. I think there's a real opportunity, the best opportunity we've had in some time. We can get a climate bill or set of bills onto the Senate floor, something we couldn't have done with Mitch McConnell. And there probably are, in fact, just before this segment, I was listening to MSNBC and my friend Sheldon Whitehouse, who's one of the leaders among the Senate Democrats when it comes to climate action, does seem fairly optimistic that, look, there's a handful of Republicans who are willing to join with Democrats on some common sense, basic compromise climate legislation. We got $35 billion of green stimulus in that stimulus bill. And so that shows that you can get Republicans and Democrats both on board with legislation if there are incentives for both to act in good faith. And that's going to be the challenge, to find those Republicans who will work with Democrats in good faith. Some of them won't. There's that residual sort of poisonous Trumpist segment of the Republican Party that probably won't engage meaningfully on issues like climate change as long as they're captured by the fossil fuel industry. But I think there are some who will join with Democrats. I think we're going to get meaningful climate legislation within the next 2 years. And who knows, 2 years from now, we might have those larger majorities where we can do something even bolder.
Right, and Lisa Murkowski being one of those Republicans who's shown that she's willing to do deals and comes from an energy exporting state. Leah
Yeah.
Stokes, some Democrats are embracing the term socialist, Bernie Sanders, of course, and others, and the Green New Deal has been branded as socialist because it mentions the guarantee of a job with a family sustaining wage. Moderate Democrats say that word is toxic and will cause them to lose their seats. Tough midterms ahead in 2022. Where are you on using that term socialism? Do you embrace it? Do you run from it?
I mean, I don't focus too much on that particular term in my own work. It's not a term I use to describe myself, but it's also not a term that I think that other people shouldn't be using. I think people are more than welcome to use that term if they want to. But to me, the issue is not really about left or right ideology. It's actually about creating a livable future for current generations. And that is not an ideological issue. If you look at polling from Pew or the Yale program on climate change communication, young Republicans are very worried about climate change. People, more around my age in their 20s or their 30s. And that's because they realize that when we talk about 2050, that's not sometime way in the future. That's within our lifespans. That's within our adulthood. And we have to have a livable planet. So I think that a lot of these fights over ideology and labels are missing the point, which is that the economy, our society, our democracy is built on a bedrock of a stable climate. This is the only stable climate we have, and it is the only climate we have ever lived in as humans. And if we disrupt that, that has nothing to do with being left or right. It just has to do with, whether or not we have a stable economy, a stable society, a stable way for people to plan in the future. And that isn't about being left or right wing. It's really about, as Michael was saying, common sense solutions that we have to have a livable planet for our economy, let alone our society, to thrive.
Michael Mann, what is an inactivist, and how do people on the left bring them gifts every day?
Yeah, well, this conversation we're having right now leads naturally into this discussion in the new climate war. I talk about sort of the challenges that we face now. We're so close. Leah and I and so many others have been working so hard, and we're so close to really finally turning the corner on climate. But the forces of inaction fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding, their forces of inaction, and I call them the inactivists, haven't given up. Look, they can't deny that climate change is happening anymore. So they've shifted to a whole new array of tactics in their efforts to prevent us from making that transition from renewable to renewable energy, from fossil fuel energy. And one of the things that they've tried to do is to divide us. And using labels is a great way to try to do that, right? To instill tribalism. And they've really worked hard to divide the climate advocacy community. So that we don't speak with one unified voice demanding action. And so that's one of the things that we have to look out for, how language is being used online and elsewhere in an effort to divide us, how individual lifestyle choices and things of this sort are being used, once again, to divide us. Dividing is one of the critical tools that the inactivists are using to prevent us from acting.
Right. And Leah Stokes, how do you think about that? The tribalism, Freud, you have an undergraduate degree in psychology. Freud talked about the narcissism of the small difference. We don't need other people to that's kind of natural and human nature, is to kind of some of the, inside circular firing squad kinds of things. That comes naturally. We don't need inactivists to cause that to happen.
Especially within the Democratic community.
That's what I was going to say, Mike. Exactly.
Sorry.
The Democrats, no, I'm agreeing with you. Exactly. That the Democrats appear to be really very adept at disagreeing with each other. I mean, I think that it's difficult because, I'm a social scientist. And so part of my job, I was trained in econometrics. I know how to do post hoc evaluations of policy. I have a PhD in public policy. And so, part of my job as a researcher is to evaluate policy and to try to figure out, did this get us where we need to go? Is it going to get us there fast enough? That's sort of my job. And so on the one hand, when people like me, critique policies or engage in our research to try to, uncover what might be tools that get us where we need to go from a political perspective, from an effectiveness perspective, that can be used by others to say, oh, we shouldn't act. But it's important that people like myself are honest and speak the truth and, do empirical research and put that forward. So for example, on carbon pricing, right? Carbon pricing is something that I have studied for quite a while. My partner has actually written an entire book on carbon pricing all around the world. It's funny when I look back on my early writing on climate change. I've been doing this for 15 years now, climate policy. I was pretty pro carbon pricing. I studied the EU ETS. These were things, that's the EU emissions trading scheme.
Thank you.
Very prominent cap and trade program, the most prominent globally. And, I was very pro these things, but I think we have to realize that there are studies coming out now from economics, from political science, from other disciplines that are pointing to these policies not moving fast enough. There was actually a meta review that just came out yesterday by Jessica Green, a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto, where she looks at all the post hoc assessments of carbon pricing. There's about 37 in the peer-reviewed literature. And, most of them create estimates between 0 to 2% annual reductions. And when we think about the challenge before us that Mike so eloquently laid out about, we have to cut emissions by about half by 2030, according to the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scientific bodies major report from 2018, is 2% a year going to be big enough? And we have to think about the distributive politics of this, by which I mean who pays for the transition, not just how expensive is the transition. And so my own view is that we have to put more of the costs of the clean energy transition onto government balance sheets and less of it onto everyday low-income people. Because right now, especially during the pandemic, so many people are struggling to pay their electricity bills. But I also understand where Mike is coming from, where he says, ultimately, we're going to have to get a deal in Congress. We're going to have to use every tool in the toolbox. And carbon pricing might need to be one of those tools. I agree. I just think that we have to be clear-eyed about how effective that tool might be and, have a dialogue within our scientific community around that. But Mike is right. That can really be used to divide the community and can potentially lead to inaction. So I take his critique seriously and think about that in my own work.
10 years ago, Brandon Dennison founded Coalfield Development in Barboursville, West Virginia. They train former coal miners and other locals for jobs in new industries, including solar. We asked him to share his thoughts on how the Biden administration might approach Appalachia and in the region in need of both an economic boost and a green energy reset.
We exist to rebuild the Appalachian economy from the ground up. So we helped start the first solar company in this part of the state. We have a sustainable agriculture company. We've done some recycled content manufacturing concepts. We've trained a total of just over 1,200 people, and about a quarter of those were connected to the coal industry prior to their training with us. We have seen coal miners become renewable energy workers, and sometimes the skills are quite transferable. The first ever crew chief of our solar enterprise was an underground miner who was already a licensed electrician because of the nature of the equipment that he worked on underground. So it is possible, but it's way harder than most folks realize. And there's a lot of frustration in coal country. You know, a lot of times the national discussion sort of flippantly says, well, we can just retrain those people. Part of the problem is that the new jobs don't pay as well as the coal jobs did. You could have only a high school education and earn $70,000 or $80,000 a year in the coal industry. And that's just not the case right now in some of the other renewable energy industries. Now, the Biden administration, there is a lot of talk and even written proposals in their transition plans to support coal communities. And I think there's going to be dollars attached to that, and that's good. I would caution that folks here in Appalachia are really skeptical of new government programs. So we need government investment, but we want to contribute and be part of businesses and start our own businesses, and we don't want to have to depend on the government to put food on the table. So I would encourage maybe a more liberal administration that, yes, we need those federal investments, but do it in a way that honors the dignity and the agency of the people and the communities here on the ground. People need individual financial assistance. I don't want to dismiss that. But long term, we need to support our local entrepreneurs and our local small businesses that are trying to do things the right way and that are trying to be environmentally sustainable. Involving local leaders and involving the private sector is going to be really important to figuring this transition out.
Leah Stokes, as someone who's written about clean energy jobs around the country, I'd like to hear your reaction to Brandon Dennison's pointing out he's CEO of the Coalfield Development in Barboursville, West Virginia. I'd like to hear your response to him saying that retraining is possible. It's way harder than most people realize, and clean energy jobs often pay less.
Yeah, well, those facts are fairly well known, unfortunately, to be true. And I think we have to reckon with them when we think about the transition. Right now, unionization rates in the clean energy economy are much lower than within the fossil fuel industry. And that's a problem because it means that the pay is not as good, that the representation is not as good, benefits aren't as good. So we really have to figure out how we can get unionization rates up in the clean energy industry. And that's going to involve companies like, for example, Tesla, major car manufacturer that has not been pro-unionization, coming around to unionization at their plants, right? If we have combustion engine cars, fossil fuel powered cars that can be built in union shops, but we don't have electric vehicles being built in union shops, that is a problem. So I think that in some ways, actually, California has done a good job of this. The way that they designed their clean energy standard means that a lot of the jobs are built in state and a lot of the work is actually unionized in California as a result of, the existing unions in California and the way they structured their policy. So I think that this is a big challenge going forward. And there's a trade-off here too, right? Because on the one hand, if we have more high-paying jobs in the clean energy economy, which I fully support, that will also make the clean energy transition more expensive, right? And so jobs and benefits on the one side are also costs on the other side. And that's why I don't necessarily think the goal should always be doing things the most efficiently as possible, minimizing costs, because costs are also benefits for other people through high-paying jobs. And I think that he made many good points when he talked about how the goal would be to have support from the federal government to kickstart initiatives, but then those companies would grow over time and create their own reinforcing cycle. What's been so unfortunate through, for example, the CARES Act, which was the coronavirus stimulus bill passed last year through the Republican controlled Senate, is that money did not go to small businesses. It did not go to people who were going to try and employ people and create opportunity and start to build the new future. A lot of it went to very large fossil fuel companies who, I will mention, were laying off massive amounts of workers during the pandemic. There were fossil fuel companies, I believe Exxon is the one, that were more willing to fire people during a global pandemic and economic crisis than cut dividends for their shareholders. So the fossil fuel industry is increasingly becoming a pretty bad employer, not just from a sort of health and safety perspective, but also just from in terms of protecting its workers during a really critical time. And so I think we need to realize that this transition is happening now, that there are already people being laid off by the irresponsible fossil fuel industry, that the fossil fuel industry is getting a lot of government handouts and is not using them to employ people. And so we need to be putting federal dollars, investing them into the clean economy so that there can be small businesses in places like West Virginia, and so that we can start this transition and pay people really a livable and a good paying job.
I'll just mention though, Leah Stokes, that those dividends, dividends are very important for energy shareholders, people who own stock in energy companies, and the companies are loath to cut those dividends. But those dividends are also income for pensioners and people, teachers and others. So those dividends do go to some people who rely on them in some cases for their income. Michael Mann, Brandon Dennison also mentioned honoring the dignity and agency of fossil fuel workers. I rarely hear that in climate conversations, which often vilify the fossil fuel industry as though it's a monolith. I want to hear your thoughts on that, that talking about, because the concern is that, coastal elites talk down to fossil fuel workers and the retraining is oversold, green jobs are oversold. I'd like to hear your point on that empathy and dignity he talked about.
Yeah, it's important. And I'll tell you, the fossil fuel industry has done a wonderful job in, with their with the propaganda campaign that they have implemented to convince us that the corporate profits that go to the fossil fuel interests somehow represent the good of the people who work for those interests. There's a big difference between a coal worker who statistically speaking, will ultimately suffer health consequences for the dangerous nature of that job. There's a huge difference between them and the management and the owners who make record profits off of the backs of these workers who make a decent wage, but pay for it ultimately in health and in other ways. And so what we have to recognize is that, look, those people, in a sense, are heroes, right? Here, I live in a state, Pennsylvania, that is a true fossil fuel state. It's where we discovered oil in this country. It is where, it was built on coal substantially, and now natural gas is an important emerging part of the economy here. I have an appreciation for the role that the fossil fuel industry has played in providing for, jobs and
some people say we ought to just thank them. Thank them. Thank you for what you did. And let's thank you for that century of building America. Now we need to turn to a new direction. Thank you.
That's the point. That's exactly. Yeah. There's a saying, the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones, and the fossil fuel age won't end for want of fossil fuels. It'll end because something better has come along, and that's renewable energy. And so we have to thank those people for having grown the economy that we all benefit from today, while jointly recognizing that it is time to move on. And, I speak in parts of the state that are coal country, and where the college kids that I'm speaking to come from coal families. And the reason they were able to go to college in part was because of the career of their parents in that industry. We need to make sure that they have other opportunities to get a living wage, and also to not have to make the health sacrifices that fossil fuel workers have had to make in the past. And if you were to account for the health damages of fossil fuel extraction on the people who do it and the people in those communities, if you were to actually incorporate that into the price tag, fossil fuel energy would be remarkably outcompeted by renewable energy. And the problem is that that isn't in the price tag right now. Fossil fuel industry is getting a free ride. The damage they're doing to the planet and the damage that they're doing to their workers, to the health of their workers and people in the communities is not part of the price tag. That's why I do think that carbon pricing is one of the tools that we need in the toolbox to help level that playing field so that renewable energy can compete fairly in the marketplace.
And Michael Mann, climate science is often thought of as dark and scary, but there's actually been some positive climate science recently about how quickly the climate would stabilize if we got to zero emissions. So tell us about that promising science.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny, and Leah, I'm sure appreciates this as well. In the scientific community, we've known for about a decade now, the concept of a carbon budget is based on the emergent science that shows that the amount of warming that you get at the surface anyways is pretty much a consequence of the cumulative emissions up to that point in time. That's why we can define a carbon budget for avoiding certain warming targets. And that's, of course, conflicts with the prevalent view that is still out there, and so many people still think it's the current scientific consensus that if we stop burning fossil fuels, if we stop emitting carbon, that the planet will continue to warm up for decades. A lot of people still think that. That was our messaging for a number of years, and it was based on outdated climate model experiments that were very simplistic. We used to treat carbon dioxide as a control knob, and we turn it up, and yeah, if we have our hand on the knob and we turn it up and we stop it, the surface continues to warm for a few decades because of what we call the thermal inertia. The oceans, the sluggishness of the oceans, they continue to warm up for decades into the future in response to the greenhouse gases we've already put in the atmosphere. But what we weren't doing in those experiments is incorporating the fact that the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere are dynamic components of the system. And so when you put carbon into the atmosphere, they take some of that carbon out. And if we stop burning carbon, the oceans in particular are continuing to draw down carbon. And it turns out that CO2 levels actually go down. That sort of curves down. That offsets the curve up that we would expect from that committed warming, that thermal inertia. The net result, a flat line. If you stop burning carbon, surface temperatures stabilize within a few years. That's important because it means that there is an immediate and direct response to our actions.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. Thanks to our online audience. We'll see you next time, everybody.